You are standing inside the largest city in the ancient Americas. Not a settlement, not a ceremonial site, a city. The Pyramid of the Sun rises 216 feet above you. 3 million tons of stone and compressed earth, aligned to the setting sun with a precision modern engineers still find difficult to explain. Broad avenues stretch for miles in perfect geometric order. Apartment compounds house artisans, traders, and laborers drawn from across an entire continent. 200,000 people live here. The year is 550 AD. Then someone gives a signal, and they burn it to the ground. Not the homes, not the markets, the temples, the palaces, the seats of power. Specifically those. A radiocarbon dating places the burning layer between 535 and 580 AD across multiple elite structures simultaneously. Chemical analysis by Linda Manzanilla in 2006 revealed the fires reached temperatures above 900 degrees Celsius, hot enough to vitrify stone. George Cowgill's analysis confirmed the destruction was targeted, elite religious centers reduced to ash, while residential quarters remained largely untouched. This was not an accident. This was not a foreign army. Someone inside this city decided what to burn and what to leave standing. But here is what keeps historians up at night. In 600 years of dominance, across 8 square miles of murals, monuments, and carved stone, documented by Arthur Miller in 1973, the people of Teotihuacan left not a single confirmed image of a ruler. No kings, no royal portraits, no dynastic records carved into stone. Egypt has its pharaohs. The Maya have their god kings. Teotihuacan, nothing. Every other major civilization of the ancient world recorded who was in charge. This one either could not or chose not to. Obsidian Workshop Analysis by Michael Spence in 1996 showed production stopped mid-manufacture in some cases. Workers simply put down their tools and walked away. When the Aztecs later stumbled upon these ruins, they named the place Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born, because they believed no human hands could have raised something so vast. Even they had no memory of who had actually lived there. If this was a revolution, historians ask, where are the bodies? And where are the mass graves of the defeated elite? Civil conflict leaves evidence. Teotihuacan left almost none. Archaeologist Saburo Sugiyama's excavations in the 1990s found ritual deposits carefully sealed just before the burning. Offerings placed with intention, not panic. Records from Maya inscriptions describe fire events not as destruction, but as ritual endings, deliberate closings of cosmic cycles. Could 200,000 people have collectively agreed to end their own civilization at a cosmologically significant moment? Could the absence of rulers mean something far stranger than we assume? a city governed not by kings, but by collective decision. The burning concentrated on temples. Offerings were sealed before the fires. Workers stopped mid-task. The population dispersed, but did not die. This was not conquest. The evidence points to something history rarely records, a civilization that may have chosen to terminate itself. We still do not know if what happened here was murder, or something closer to a farewell. And Teotihuacan is only where this story begins. Because across 10 civilizations, separated by oceans, centuries, and entirely different ways of organizing human life, the same pattern emerges. Cities that ruled the known world, armies that answered to no rival, engineers who bent rivers to their will and raised monuments that still stand. And then, within a generation, sometimes within a decade, silence. Not the slow silence of decline, the sudden silence of a house where someone was just speaking, and then was not. If this story is already making you question what you thought you knew, stay close. What comes next is stranger. Inscriptions, ice cores, flood layers, and abandoned workshop floors are going to tell us something. The history books rarely say plainly, no civilization has ever looked fragile, right up until the moment it broke. From a city burned by its own hands, we travel to a place where millions vanished without leaving a single readable word behind. A civilization so large, so advanced, and so completely erased from memory that we still cannot decode their script. The Indus Valley is next. The ruins were already ancient when the Aztecs found them. They walked through the empty avenues, looked up at the pyramids, and concluded the only reasonable explanation. Gods had built this place, not men. Gods. And they named it Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born, because nothing in their experience suggested human hands were capable of something so vast. They were not wrong to be confused. They simply did not know what we now know. And what we now know is, in some ways, more unsettling than divine origin. At its peak, Teotihuacan was not simply a city. It was a system. Trade routes extended from what is now Arizona down through Honduras. Obsidian, the sharpest cutting material in the pre-metal world, was processed here in industrial quantities and distributed across an entire continent. Apartment compounds housed specialist craftsmen, potters, weavers, lapidaries, merchants. Different ethnic groups maintained their own residential districts within the city's grid, suggesting not just power, but organized cosmopolitan administration. The avenues were not built for convenience. They were aligned to celestial events, solstices, the Pleiades, the passage of Venus, with an accuracy that implies sustained astronomical observation across generations. The city took roughly 500 years to reach its full form. It sustained itself at that scale for another century after that. Then the fires began. Radiocarbon analysis places the burning between 535 and 580 AD. But what the dates alone do not convey is the pattern. And the pattern is what changes the interpretation entirely. The fires were not random. They were not spread by wind or panic. They moved with purpose through the city's elite zones, the temples, the administrative palaces, the ceremonial centers. Residential quarters, the homes of laborers, artisans, ordinary families, were left standing. Someone, or many people, acting in coordination, chose exactly what to burn. Chemical analysis confirmed the fires reached temperatures above 900 degrees Celsius in targeted locations. That level of heat is not accidental. It requires sustained fuel, deliberate placement, and, most critically, time. Nobody interrupted it. Here is the detail that breaks the accepted narrative open. Archaeologist Saburo Sugiyama's excavations in the 1990s found ritual deposits sealed just before the burning events, offerings carefully placed and closed, as though completing a ceremony rather than fleeing one. The deposits were not scattered. They were not abandoned mid-ritual in panic. They were finished. Obsidian workshops, by contrast, stopped mid-production. Tools left beside unfinished blades, not destroyed, simply left, as though the workers stood up, put down what they were making, and did not return. Two separate behaviors, two separate rhythms, both pointing toward the same conclusion. This was not chaos. This was organized. The question historians have carried for decades is deceptively simple. If an external enemy had attacked, an army, a rival state, a coalition of displaced peoples, they would have left evidence, weapons, mass graves, destruction layers across residential zones, conquest narratives carved into the monuments of whatever replaced Teotihuacan. None of that exists here, and Teotihuacan left no records of its own rulers to begin with. No king lists, no dynastic inscriptions, and no portraits of the people who governed 600 years of continental dominance. Which means there is no record of who gave the final order either. Only the ash layer remains. Precise, selective, undeniable. The city that commanded trade across an entire continent, that aligned its streets to the stars, that housed 200,000 people in organized compounds, did not fall to an enemy. The evidence, such as it is, points inward. Whether that burning represented revolt from below, a ritual termination of a cosmic cycle, or something no existing historical category can fully describe, the result was the same. The city ended, the people dispersed, and the pyramid stood empty for 1,000 years before anyone thought to ask why. We do not yet have a word for what Teotihuacan did to itself. But moving east across oceans and centuries, there is a civilization that raises an equally quiet, equally disturbing question, not about fire, but about silence. They left no readable final words, no conquest, no catastrophe the eye can follow, just cities, and then the slow absence of cities. The Indus Valley is next, Somewhere beneath the plains of modern Pakistan and northwestern India, there are drains older than the pyramids of Giza. Not symbolic drains, not ceremonial channels carved for ritual effect. Functional, brick-lined, covered sewage systems running beneath the streets of cities that housed tens of thousands of people. Cities built, according to current chronologies, as far back as 2600 BC. Rome would not achieve comparable urban sanitation for another 2,000 years. That fact alone should give pause. But it is not the most unsettling thing about the Indus Valley civilization. The most unsettling thing is what they chose, or failed, to leave behind. At its height, the civilization stretched across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were its largest known centers, but archaeologists have now identified over 1,000 sites scattered across the region. The streets of these cities were laid on a grid. Buildings were constructed from standardized kiln-fired bricks, the same dimensions, site to site, across hundreds of miles, implying not just shared practice, but coordinated production at a scale that suggests centralized planning of some kind. Trade reached far beyond the subcontinent. Indus Valley seals, small carved stones bearing symbols and animal imagery, have been recovered from Mesopotamian sites, indicating sustained commercial contact with the civilizations of modern Iraq. Weights and measures were standardized across the entire network. This was not a collection of villages. This was a functioning civilization operating at continental scale. And then, after around 1900 BC, the cities began to empty. Not all at once. The process unfolded over generations. Population shifting eastward, urban centers contracting, the dense administrative machinery of the cities gradually dissolving. By roughly 1300 BC, the great urban phase was over. For a long time, the assumed explanation was invasion, the arrival of new peoples from the northwest, bringing disruption and displacement. Early archaeological interpretations leaned toward evidence of violence, unburied skeletons at Mohenjo-Daro, bodies in the streets. More recent and thorough analysis has quietly dismantled that picture. The skeletal remains, when properly examined, showed no consistent evidence of mass violence, no weapons caches, no destruction layers of the kind that mark conquest, no sudden rupture in the archaeological record that would indicate an army moving through. What the record shows instead is withdrawal, gradual, sustained, and in some areas apparently deliberate. Climate data is now central to the emerging explanation. Paleoclimatological studies indicate that the South Asian monsoon weakened significantly after around 2100 BC, a shift that would have reduced river flow, stressed agriculture, and made the dense urban populations of the Indus cities increasingly difficult to sustain. The Ghaggar-Hakra river system, which supported numerous settlements, appears to have contracted substantially during this period. The cities did not burn. They thinned. People moved where water still reached. Settlements multiplied in the east and south. smaller and less architecturally ambitious, but continuous. The population did not vanish. It redistributed, carrying with it, presumably, memory, practice, and identity in forms archaeology cannot easily trace. Here is the point where the story becomes genuinely strange. On the Indus Valley, civilization had a writing system. Hundreds of inscribed seals and tablets survive. The script has been studied for over a century by linguists, mathematicians, and computational analysts from around the world. It has never been deciphered, not partially decoded, not provisionally read. The script remains entirely unreadable. We do not know what language underlies it. We do not know whether the inscriptions are administrative records, religious texts, personal names, or something with no equivalent category in any other ancient culture. They wrote things down. We simply cannot read what they said. One of the largest, most organized, most geographically extensive civilizations in human history declined across several generations, and left no readable account of why. Or whether that silence was the result of a writing system too brief for full expression, a gradual loss of the scribal tradition as cities emptied, or something else entirely, is a question that remains open. The last message of the Indus Valley civilization is still in front of us. We just do not have the key. Drought moves slowly. It empties cities across generations, leaving time to adapt, to migrate, to carry something forward. But not every civilization was granted that gradual warning. Some were given a single day and a sky that turned to ash. The Minoans are next. The ash layer is still there, deposited across the eastern Mediterranean floor, preserved in ice cores drilled from Greenland, immeasurable in tree rings that recorded a sudden narrowing of growth across the northern hemisphere. The eruption of Thera left a geological signature so distinctive that scientists can detect it from thousands of miles away across 3,000 years of accumulated sediment. The civilization that lived closest to it, survived. That is the part the story rarely leads with. By around 1600 BC, the Minoans of Crete had built something with no real precedent in the Aegean world. Knossos, their largest palace complex, covered an area of approximately 20,000 square meters across multiple stories, with storage magazines, ceremonial halls, workshops, and a drainage system sophisticated enough to include flush mechanisms. Frescoes covered interior walls with images of acrobats, marine life, and processional ceremonies rendered in confident, fluid brushwork that suggests not just technical skill, but a culture comfortable enough with beauty to make it architectural. Their real power, however, was maritime. Minoan trading vessels moved copper, tin, pottery, and luxury goods across a network that reached Egypt, the Levant, Cyprus, and the Greek mainland. Egyptian tomb paintings from the period depict figures carrying Minoan-style vessels as tribute. They did not simply participate in Mediterranean trade. For a period, they shaped it. Then, sometime around 1600 BC, the volcanic island of Thera, roughly 100 kilometers north of Crete, erupted. the scale is difficult to frame in familiar terms. Geological analysis suggests it was among the largest volcanic events of the past 10,000 years. The eruption column reached the stratosphere. Ash fell across the eastern Mediterranean, documented in sediment cores from the seabed. Tsunamis radiated outward from the collapsed caldera. Coastlines throughout the Aegean were struck. Minoan harbour sites on Crete show evidence of tsunami damage in this period. Destruction layers displaced building materials, disrupted stratigraphic sequences. And yet, Knossos continued. Minoan palace culture continued. The administrative systems, the trade networks, the art, all of it continued for approximately 150 years after the eruption. They absorbed what should, by any reasonable measure, have been a civilization-ending event, and they carried on. This is where the accepted narrative quietly breaks apart. On around 1450 BC, roughly a century and a half after Thera, palaces across Crete burned. Zakros, Malia, Phaistos, and others show destruction layers concentrated within the same general period. The destruction at these sites has the character of violence, not accident. At roughly the same time, Linear B tablets begin appearing at Knossos, a different script from the Minoan Linear A, and one that has been successfully deciphered. Linear B is an early form of Greek. The administrative language of Knossos had changed. What this indicates, in the assessment of most current scholarship, is a Mycenaean takeover of Crete following the palace destructions. The civilization that had survived a catastrophic volcanic eruption did not survive the political and military opportunism of a neighboring culture that moved into the weakness the eruption had created. A weakness that accumulated over generations before it became fatal. Thera did not destroy the Minoans directly. It destabilized them, disrupting harvests, damaging coastal infrastructure, straining trade relationships already dependent on precise seasonal rhythms. The eruption created a long, slow fracture in a system that had previously appeared impregnable. By the time the final blow came, the Minoans may not have had the resources, the population, or the political cohesion to resist it. The civilization that outlasted an apocalypse was ultimately undone, not by fire from the earth, but by the prolonged quiet damage that fire left behind. They survived the sky falling. What they could not survive was everything that came after. The Minoans lost a civilization. What came next on the Greek mainland lost something arguably more irreplaceable. Not cities, not palaces, not trade. An entire civilization forgot how to write. The Mycenaeans are next. The last Linear B tablet from the Palace of Pylos is an administrative record, not a farewell, not a warning. An inventory, livestock counts, land assessments, the routine bureaucratic output of a functioning state. Scholars who have studied the final archive at Pylos note that the tablets were being baked in a fire when the palace itself burned, around 1180 BC. The fire that destroyed the palace accidentally preserved its final documents. The last thing the Mycenaean scribes recorded was a list. Then the writing stopped and did not return to Greece for roughly 400 years. At their height, the Mycenaeans had built a palace civilization of considerable sophistication. Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos were centers of redistributive economies, systems in which the palace collected agricultural surplus, craft production, and tribute from surrounding territories, then redistributed resources according to administrative need. Linear B tablets from multiple sites record rations for workers, inventories of bronze weapons, lists of rowers assigned to vessels, and religious offerings allocated to specific deities. This was a literate bureaucracy, a functioning state apparatus that ran on written record-keeping across multiple palace centers simultaneously. The Mediterranean trade network these palaces participated in was genuinely intercontinental, connecting the Greek mainland to Anatolia, Cyprus, the Levant, Egypt, Sicily, and Sardinia, in a web of copper, tin, grain, textiles, and luxury goods so interdependent that disruption at one node sent tremors through all the others. It was, by the standards of the Bronze Age, a globalized economy. Around 1200 BC, it collapsed. Not one palace, not one region. Palace after palace across the eastern Mediterranean burned or was abandoned within roughly a 50-year window. Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos on the Greek mainland, Ugarit on the Syrian coast, a major trading hub whose final correspondence, unrecovered from its ruins, includes letters requesting urgent military assistance that apparently never arrived. Sites across Cyprus, Anatolia, and the Levant show destruction, or abandonment layers from the same general period. The scale of the collapse has no real parallel in ancient history. Entire state systems that had operated for centuries ceased to function within what, archaeologically speaking, amounts to a single moment. Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses III describe attacks by confederacies of displaced peoples, groups the inscriptions call the Sea Peoples, moving through the eastern Mediterranean and overwhelming settled civilizations in their path. For decades, this was the dominant explanation for the Bronze Age collapse. More recent scholarship has significantly complicated that picture. Seismic surveys have identified earthquake damage at several affected sites. Climate proxy data indicates drought conditions across the eastern Mediterranean beginning around 1200 BC. Systems collapse theory, applied to the Bronze Age by archaeologist Eric Klein, suggests that no single cause was sufficient, that the trade network's very sophistication made it brittle, and that simultaneous pressure from multiple directions overwhelmed a system with no capacity to absorb compounding failure. Drought strained harvests. Disrupted harvests reduced the surpluses that funded palace redistribution. Reduced redistribution destabilized the political loyalty of dependent populations. Weakened states became vulnerable to the displaced groups moving through the region. Each failure accelerated the next. But here is the detail that reframes everything stated above. When Greece became literate again, roughly 4 centuries later, it used an entirely different writing system, a Phoenician-derived alphabet with no structural connection to Linear B. The earlier script was not adapted or simplified. It was not passed down in reduced form through any recoverable tradition. It was forgotten completely. This means the collapse was not merely political or economic. It severed the transmission of knowledge itself. Whatever the Mycenaean scribes knew, their administrative methods, their records, their ways of organizing and preserving information, none of it crossed the gap. Greece did not just lose its palaces. It lost the institutional memory that the palaces had carried. Civilizations can rebuild cities. They can reopen trade routes, raise new walls, crown new kings. What they cannot always recover is what was only ever written down, and is no longer readable. A writing system, once lost, may never return. But what the Mycenaeans lost over centuries, the next empire lost in what may have been a single decade, not to armies, not to earthquakes, but to the sky refusing to rain. The Akkadian Empire is next. There is a text that survived the collapse it describes. Written in Sumerian, composed sometime after the fall of the Akkadian Empire, the Curse of Akkad is one of the oldest literary works in human history. It describes a civilization undone not by armies, not by political failure, but by the withdrawal of something far more fundamental. The text records fields producing only weeds, irrigation channels carrying only silence. The great cities emptied not by conquest, but by the slow failure of the earth to yield what people needed to survive. Scholars debated for a long time whether this was poetry or memory. The geological record has since made that question considerably harder to dismiss. The Akkadian Empire was, by any measure, a genuine historical threshold. Before Sargon of Akkad, who seized power around 2330 BC, the ancient Near East was organized around competing city-states, each sovereign, each limited in reach. Sargon changed the model. Through a combination of military conquest and administrative reorganization, he brought Mesopotamia and surrounding territories under unified control, creating what historians now recognize as the world's first territorial empire. His inscriptions describe campaigns reaching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast. Trade networks under Akkadian administration connected Mesopotamia to Anatolia, the Indus Valley, and the Gulf trading ports. A standardized system of weights, measures, and administrative language extended across the entire domain. His grandson, Naram-Sin, pushed the empire further still, taking the title King of the Four Quarters of the World, a claim whose ambition was not entirely without basis. The empire had, at its height, no obvious rival capable of dismantling it from outside. Around 2200 BC, something began to shift. Paleoclimatological records, drawn from lake sediment cores, marine deposits, and soil analysis across the Middle East, document a pronounced arid episode beginning around this period. The event is now classified in climate science as the 4.2 kilo-year event, a sustained drought affecting a broad band of the northern hemisphere for what proxy records suggest was somewhere between 100 and 200 years. For an empire whose agricultural base depended on the rain-fed highlands of northern Mesopotamia, the timing was catastrophic. Dust records from the Gulf of Oman, analyzed by geologist Peter Domenical and colleagues, show a sharp increase in wind-blown sediment during this period, an indicator of severe surface desiccation across the Akkadian agricultural heartland. Soil analyses at the site of Tel Leilan in modern Syria, conducted by Harvey Weiss in the 1980s, revealed a sudden abandonment layer dated to approximately 2200 BC, overlaid by a thick deposit of wind-blown dust consistent with prolonged drought. The fields were not burned, they were not plundered, they dried out. Here is where the curse of Akkad stops reading like poetry. The text describes the rivers running with bitter water. It describes the fields yielding salt instead of grain. It describes the roads of the empire going silent. No caravans, no movement, no commerce. These are not metaphors for political instability. They are descriptions of ecological failure, precise enough that, when set alongside the geochemical record, the correspondence becomes difficult to dismiss. An ancient literary text and a modern sediment core are describing the same event from different directions. Without reliable harvests, the redistributive systems that held the empire together began to fail, and garrison towns in drought-affected regions could no longer be provisioned. Populations from the abandoned north moved south into the Akkadian heartland, creating resource pressure at the center. Regional governors who had previously been subordinate found less reason to remain so. The empire did not fall in a single military defeat. It fragmented, progressively, administratively, almost bureaucratically, as the infrastructure of control became too expensive to maintain without the agricultural surplus that had funded it. Sargon had built his empire on the fertility of the land. When the land failed, the empire had nothing left to stand on. The first empire in human history was not defeated by a rival, it was outlasted by a drought. The Akkadian Empire left royal inscriptions, literary texts, and administrative records that allow us to trace, however imperfectly, what was lost. The next civilization left almost none of that. Only earthworks remain, massive, deliberate, and almost entirely forgotten, in a place most people have never been taught to look. Cahokia is next. There is a mound in southern Illinois that took more earth to construct than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is not famous. Most people who live within driving distance of it have never heard its name. It sits quietly beside a highway, grassed over, unremarkable at first glance, the largest surviving earthwork in the Americas, built by a civilization that, for reasons still not fully understood, was almost entirely erased from the historical memory of the continent it once dominated. The mound did not disappear. And the knowledge of who built it did. At its peak, around 1100 AD, Cahokia was home to an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 people. Within the city center itself, with a broader regional population that some archaeologists place considerably higher. It occupied a flood-rich confluence near the junction of the Missouri, Illinois, and Mississippi rivers, a position that made it the natural hub of a trade network extending from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. Monk's Mound its central structure, rises approximately 30 meters across a base larger than the footprint of the Great Pyramid. It was constructed in stages over roughly 300 years, not by forced labor under a centralized command, as far as current evidence suggests, but through sustained, organized communal effort whose social mechanisms remain a matter of active debate. Around it, a planned urban landscape extended across roughly 15 square kilometers. Plazas, residential districts, and a series of large, circular timber post alignments, now called wood henge, were arranged with orientations corresponding to solstice and equinox sunrise positions. As at Teotihuacan, astronomical precision was built into the city's physical structure. This was not a ceremonial site visited seasonally. People lived here, governed here, and organized continental-scale exchange from here. The trade network centered on Cahokia moved copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, and distinctive ceramic styles that archaeologists have traced across hundreds of miles in multiple directions. Of the city's influence on surrounding cultures, visible in shared iconography, burial practices, and architectural forms, extended across what is now the eastern United States. When European explorers eventually reached the Mississippi Valley, they encountered smaller, dispersed communities. None of them identified Cahokia as an ancestral city. None carried a clear oral tradition connecting them to its construction. A metropolis that had shaped a continent's cultural landscape for centuries had been, in effect, forgotten by the peoples living nearest to it. This is the detail that reorients the entire picture. When Spanish and French explorers documented the Mississippi region in the 16th and 17th centuries, they described the earthworks but could find no living tradition that explained them. Local indigenous groups, armed when asked, either had no account of the mound's origins or attributed them to peoples distinct from themselves. Cahokia had been abandoned by approximately 1350 AD, roughly 2 centuries before European contact. Within 2 generations of abandonment, the institutional memory of who had built it appears to have dissolved. A city does not disappear from memory that completely, unless the social structures that carried that memory also collapsed. The causes of Cahokia's decline are still being assembled from incomplete evidence. Tree ring data and floodplain sediment analysis indicate significant flooding events in the 12th and 13th centuries, likely worsened by the extensive deforestation required to sustain a city of that size. As pollen records show a sharp decline in forest cover around the city during its peak, a pattern consistent with resource exhaustion at the scale the population demanded. Political instability may have compounded environmental pressure. Evidence of defensive palisade construction around the city center in its later phases suggests a community preparing against threat, whether external or internal. The population did not vanish. It dispersed, southward, eastward, into smaller settlements that left thinner archaeological traces. But what dispersed with them, and what was lost in the dispersal, is precisely what the record cannot recover. Cahokia's greatest monument is still standing. The civilization that raised it is still, in the most meaningful sense, missing. Kimsun Cahokia vanished from memory 2 centuries before anyone from outside the continent arrived to record it. But on the other side of the world, a city far larger was not forgotten. It was simply swallowed, not by time, by the jungle itself. Angkor is next. Angkor. What was never lost? That is the detail that complicates the familiar story. The temples were never buried, never forgotten by the people living around them, never truly abandoned in the way the word is usually meant. Buddhist monks maintained a continuous presence at the site across the centuries of supposed disappearance. Local communities knew exactly where it was and what it was. What was lost was not the monument. What was lost was the civilization that had made the monument meaningful. At its height in the 12th and 13th centuries A.D., but the Khmer Empire's capital at Angkor was among the largest pre-industrial urban complexes on Earth. Recent LiDAR surveys, laser mapping technology deployed from aircraft across the jungle canopy, have revealed an extended urban landscape covering in excess of 1,000 square kilometers, with a density and regularity of layout that had been entirely invisible beneath the tree cover. The hydraulic infrastructure that sustained this population was its defining achievement. A network of reservoirs, canals, and distribution channels managed monsoon rainfall across the landscape, storing water through the wet season and releasing it through the dry. The largest reservoir, the West Baray, measures approximately 8 kilometers by 2.2 kilometers, an entirely artificial body of water, constructed and maintained by human labor at a scale that made the surrounding agricultural system possible. Angkor Wat itself, the temple complex commissioned by Suryavarman II in the 12th century, covers approximately 400 hectares and remains the largest religious monument ever constructed. Its Western orientation, unique among Khmer temples, and its extensive astronomical alignments have been documented by archaeoastronomer Robert Stenzel and colleagues, confirming that its design encoded solar and lunar calendrical precision into its physical proportions. This was not a city that grew haphazardly. It was engineered. Tree ring records and sediment analysis from the region tell a story. The stone monuments do not. Researchers, including Brendan Buckley, are using tree ring chronologies from the wider Southeast Asian region, identified extended drought periods in the 14th and 15th centuries AD, punctuated by episodes of unusually intense monsoon flooding. For a hydraulic civilization whose entire agricultural system depended on the careful management of water, the combination was particularly destructive. Droughts reducing reservoir levels below functional thresholds, followed by flood events that overwhelmed and damaged the canal infrastructure the empire depended on. Maintenance of the hydraulic network required sustained, coordinated labor organized at the state level. As political authority shifted, with the Khmer capital eventually relocating southward toward Phnom Penh, closer to the emerging maritime trade routes of the 15th century, that coordination weakened. Khmer infrastructure was not destroyed. It was simply no longer maintained, and infrastructure that is not maintained does not hold. Half a world away, cut into the rose-red sandstone cliffs of what is now southern Jordan, a different civilization had already demonstrated the same principle by a different mechanism. Petra, the Nabatean capital, was an engineering achievement of a different kind. In a desert landscape, receiving less than 100 millimeters of rainfall annually, the Nabateans constructed a hydraulic system of ceramic pipes, rock-cut channels, dams, and cisterns that captured, directed, and stored virtually every drop of water the environment offered. The city supported a population of perhaps 20,000 people in a location that, without intervention, could support almost none. Their wealth came not from agriculture, but from position. Petra sat at the intersection of caravan routes connecting Arabia, Egypt, the Mediterranean, and Mesopotamia. Frankincense, myrrh, spices, and silk moved through it. The Nabateans taxed the movement of goods and grew extraordinarily rich on the margin. Roman annexation in 106 AD ended Nabatean political independence, but not immediately Petra's prosperity. The decisive blow came more gradually. As Mediterranean sea trade routes expanded, the overland caravans that had made Petra indispensable became, route by route, unnecessary. A city built entirely on the logic of a particular trade geography found that geography quietly redrawn around it. A major earthquake in 363 AD damaged the water infrastructure significantly. Petra did not recover. Both Angkor and Petra were bypassed by the same kind of change, not conquered, not destroyed, but rendered peripheral by shifts in the systems that had made them central. Their monuments outlasted their relevance. Stone is patient, economies are not. Angkor's rulers eventually moved their capital and adapted. Petra's traders sought new routes and dispersed. But the next civilization did neither. Its kings kept raising monuments, carving their names into stone, recording their victories, commissioning ever larger temples, while the cities around those temples were already beginning to empty. The classic Maya are next. The last stela at Tikal was erected in 869 AD. Or a stela is a carved stone monument, the Maya equivalent of a royal declaration cut into permanent material. Kings commissioned them to record victories, astronomical events, dynastic succession, and the favor of gods. At Tikal, one of the largest Maya cities ever built, they had been raised with regularity for centuries. And then they stopped. Not because the stone ran out, not because the carving tradition was lost. The monuments simply ceased, mid-dynasty, without recorded explanation, at a city that had spent generations perfecting the art of declaring its own permanence. At their height, the classic Maya cities of the southern lowlands represented one of the most intellectually sophisticated urban cultures the ancient world produced. Tikal, Calakmul, and Copan were not merely population centers. They were observatories, all administrative capitals and theological statements simultaneously. Maya astronomers tracked the cycles of Venus to within a fraction of a degree across generational observation periods. Their long count calendar encoded dates spanning millions of years in either direction from a fixed cosmological origin point. Copan's hieroglyphic stairway, containing approximately 2,200 individual glyphs, remains the longest known pre-Columbian inscription in existence, recording dynastic history in a form designed explicitly for posterity. These were civilizations that thought carefully about how they would be remembered. Between approximately 800 and 900 AD, the major cities of the southern Maya lowlands were abandoned in succession. Copan shows its last dated monument in 822 AD. Calakmul's final inscription dates to 909 AD. The pattern across the region is consistent, not simultaneous collapse, but a rolling cessation of urban activity moving across the lowland zone across roughly a century. Paleoclimatological studies, including lake sediment core analysis from the Yucatan Peninsula conducted by Douglas Kennett and colleagues, document a series of severe drought episodes between approximately 800 and 1000 AD, some of the driest conditions the region had experienced in over 1,000 years. The agricultural system underpinning the Maya cities was sophisticated but inflexible. Raised field agriculture and reservoir systems could buffer moderate variation. They could not buffer mega drought. Here is the detail that fundamentally reframes what the monuments mean. Epigraphic analysis of late classic Maya inscriptions reveals an escalation in the frequency and intensity of warfare recorded on steles. During the very period the cities were beginning to contract, more monuments recording more military victories, more captured kings, more divine sanction for conflict, precisely as populations were thinning and agricultural systems were failing. The monumental program intensified as the crisis deepened. Kings appear to have responded to systemic collapse by accelerating the production of legitimizing symbols, as though the monuments themselves could stabilize what the harvest no longer could. The stone declarations of permanence grew more elaborate, in direct proportion to the instability surrounding them. On the opposite side of the Pacific, the same pattern expressed itself in a different material. Rapa Nui, Easter Island, is the most remote inhabited landmass on Earth, situated roughly 3,700 kilometers from the nearest continental coast. Its people carved and erected the moai, monolithic stone figures averaging 4 meters in height, with the largest exceeding 9 meters, distributed across the island at ceremonial platforms called ahu. Current archaeological consensus, informed by work including that of Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo, has significantly revised the earlier narrative of straightforward ecological self-destruction. Polynesian rats introduced with the original settlers consumed palm seeds at a rate that substantially accelerated deforestation independent of human cutting. And the resource collapse was real, but its causes were more complex than a simple story of overconsumption. Evidence of conflict intensifies in the archaeological record in later periods. European contact beginning in 1722 AD introduced epidemic disease to a population already under severe environmental stress. The moai continued to be raised and in some cases pulled down by rival factions through much of this deterioration. The carving did not stop because conditions improved. Two civilizations, separated by an ocean and centuries of independent development, arrived at the same response to crisis, build larger, declare louder, inscribe more permanently. The monuments at Tikal grew more elaborate in the decades before the stelae stopped entirely. Some of the moai on Rapa Nui grew taller as the forests thinned around them. What looks, from the outside, like confidence, was possibly something closer to its opposite. The monuments were never the sign that a civilization was thriving. They may have been the sign that it was afraid. 10 civilizations, 10 collapses, separated by oceans, centuries, and entirely different ways of organizing human life. But when you lay their endings beside each other, something emerges that none of them, individually, could have seen. None of them thought they were living in the final generation. That is not a poetic assumption. It is the most consistent finding across every civilization in this story. The Akkadian administrators were still issuing grain allocations as the harvests failed, and the Maya kings were still commissioning monuments as the cities thinned. The scribes at Pylos were still updating inventories the night the palace burned. Collapse from the inside does not announce itself. Laid side by side, the 10 endings in this story resolve into 5 quiet patterns. Environmental stress fractured the Akkadian Empire, the classic Maya, Angkor, and the Indus Valley, not through single catastrophic events, but through sustained pressure on agricultural systems that had no tolerance for prolonged deviation. Internal inequality and political fracture appear in the archaeology of Teotihuacan, possibly Cahokia, and the late Maya, civilizations where the evidence points inward rather than outward. Trade route collapse rendered Petra and the Mycenaean palace network non-viable, not because they were defeated, but because the economic logic that had justified their existence quietly reorganized around them. Cascading crises defined the Minoans and Rapa Nui, single, destabilizing events that did not kill directly, but removed the resilience needed to survive what followed, and cutting across all of them, the loss of narrative. Scripts unread, records unwritten, memories dispersed beyond recovery. 5 patterns, 10 civilizations. No 2 endings identical in cause, but strikingly convergent in character. Here is what the patterns share at their core. Collapse rarely looked dramatic while it was happening. It looked like delayed harvests and political disputes. It looked like migration that seemed temporary and prices that seemed manageable. It looked like monuments commissioned to project confidence that the underlying systems no longer supported. It looked, from the inside, like ordinary difficulty. The ruins remain because stone outlasts the certainty of the people who cut it. Every civilization in this story built something intended to be permanent. The pyramid, the stela, the moai, the palace archive, the carved cliff face, each was a declaration that what had been built would endure. The stone endured, the certainty did not. 10 civilizations looked permanent until the moment they did not. The question that remains, and that this story was never really equipped to answer, is a simple one. What looks permanent now?